As the latter part of the 1960s arrived, Lincoln knew that it had to do something to refresh its Continental for the 1968 model year. After all, the car had debuted in 1961 and would eventually continue all the way through the 1969 model year. It had had a pretty significant refresh for 1966 when the front-end styling would change pretty significantly and Lincoln would also reintroduce a two-door coupe. But again, by 1968, it was time to do something a little bit different. Now, again, as I mentioned, this car ran from 1961 to 1969, and the Continental really kind of dictated not only Lincoln styling, but also Ford Motor Company styling all the way through, I would say, the late 1980s, even the early 1990s, if you want to continue counting some of the boxy Panther platform cars like the Grand Marquis and the LTD Crown Victoria. And this was in stark contrast to what was being produced by Chrysler at the time and by General Motors. You have to remember that when the car debuted for 1961, those companies had cars with big fins. Think the 1961 Imperial that you see at the inset. 1961 Cadillac still had fins at the rear, although they were tastefully toned down versus the 1959 and 1960 model years. And as we take a look at the side view, we can see kind of that Ford profile, if you will, that would be characteristic of Fords for many years to come. And that's that flat fender, the flat belt line. Of course, here there's a slight kick up at the edge of the rear door, the rearmost edge of the rear door, and then a flat quarter. It's basically just a flat car. And, you know, this is not what one would call a pretty car, if you will. But it certainly is a handsome car and tastefully styled, authoritative. One could say masculine as well. And, of course, other Fords didn't have the suicide doors like this one did, but they did have that pretty boxy appeal. I think Ford designers sometimes called it a fill-the-box design or fill the cube because you are effectively just maximizing the amount of sheet metal if you were to put a box around the car because the fender tips and the rear quarters would basically hit the edges of the cube that would contain the car. But let's talk a little bit about the styling for the moment because it changed significantly for 1968. You now had the wraparound side lights or side marker lights up front, the parking lamps as well as the turn signals wrapped around the side. So did the tail lights. 1968 was the first year for that standard, so all cars had to have side markers on them. And thus Ford Motor Company designers incorporated that into the vehicle. Now, interestingly, the front turn signals here, that clear lens looks very similar to what would come out in the 1969 Mark III, but I think that they are in fact different between the two applications, although they do have two bulbs, an upper bulb for the turn signal, a lower bulb for the parking lights. You can see the little divider in the light itself if you look closely. And interestingly, this was also before you would have parking lights operating when your headlamps were on. So you could put the parking lamps on and that lower bulb would illuminate. Then when you put the headlamps on, it would not illuminate, just the headlamps would illuminate. Same with the Mark III. You also have from the side profile, the bumper looks very Mark III-ish too, but it is indeed different. Also different is the new and authoritative front end on the 68 Continental. And it was authoritative as well in 1967. The 1967 was really just a very faint revision of the 1966 model year car with a very linear-like grille. Here, the Lincoln designers tried to give it a little bit more dimension by, let's say, bestowing it with these rectangle shapes all the way around the grille and the side of the car and the back of the car, as we're going to see in a second. They have that theme repeating in a number of places. I don't know if it's any better looking than the 67. Maybe it's even a step back, but, well, it was different, let's say. And then you have, of course, the Lincoln, very Lincoln-like kind of prow on the hood, that raised dome section in the middle that protrudes out into the front header panel and the grille. That was something that Mercury would copy. It was, after all, the Lincoln Mercury division. But that was a Lincoln styling theme, as well as that trough in between the glass and the door edge, which also was copied by Mercury, but not by Ford. A couple other items to note here for 1968. Lincoln did get rid of the hood ornament and just placed the Lincoln logo there on the header panel. This was pretty typical at the time. Remember, this was the time of Ralph Nader's book, Unsafe at Any Speed. automakers were really starting to double down on safety and think about safety. And there's also thoughts that there were going to be regulations that outlawed hood ornaments. Those actually never came to pass. But consequently, if you look at a lot of American vehicles from the late 60s, you'll notice that cars that once had hood ornaments no longer had them in the late 60s, including, by the way, the Mark III, which when it was being designed and was nicknamed the Lancelot, it did have a hood ornament. But as the final design was finished, the car lost its hood ornament for those reasons. Again, it was purely safety. Aesthetically, the designers wanted them, but they thought that they were going to be illegal. As we take a look at the front end one more time of this car, this different colored car, you can see that the grille at least helps emphasize the horizontal nature of the car. Again, this was the lower, longer, wider era of vehicles. I am not quite sure why Lincoln decided to package the wipers in the opposite direction from the way that they were normally. I can't find anything in the brochures or the sales literature as to why that was done, which leads me to believe that it was either a cost-cutting item or it was a packaging issue, maybe with the wiper transmission or the wiper motor. I have no idea. If anybody knows, put a comment in the comment section. But again, I've tried to do research on that and have found no particular explanation for it. Now, as we wrap around to the rear three-quarter view, you'll notice that that rectangle theme, as I mentioned previously, is repeated here in the reverse lights that are inside in the bumper, as well as the tail lamps. And that was something that gave the overall design continuity and harmony. Something that you often see on cars. Take a look next time you're looking at one of these classics and you'll see things from the front repeated in the back. Designers today aren't always that conscientious, I feel, about the front and the rear. Oftentimes you have different people working on the front from the rear, and it's the chief designer's responsibility to really integrate that and make the car look harmonious. And at least to my end, I think that it seems as though many designers and design teams spend a lot of time on the front ends and not a lot of time on the back ends. The rear ends seem pretty generic today to me, but at least back in this day, they did not. And of course, you've got that enormously long deck lid. Interestingly, and I think because of a reason that I'll articulate here in a second, the Lincoln logo on the deck lid was different during this time frame from the Lincoln logo that was used elsewhere on the car. And that was true of the Continental, which you notice it has kind of the old school pointed star with the points that come out of, I guess I'll call it the rectangle. That was something that was used on the rest of the vehicle, but on the deck lid, they almost rotated it sideways and made it skinnier. And I think that was just simply because it would look too funny to have the regular Continental star on the deck lid, just given that there wasn't much space there. If you'll note, in 1969, when Lincoln introduced the Mark III, it came up with a new logo, the logo that Lincoln still uses today, in fact, that was introduced on the 69 Mark III. And the Mark III, on its faux Continental spare tire hump area, has the same Lincoln logo as it does on the C-pillar, and it's used throughout the rest of the car. And I think that it was okay in that case because you had a large vertical space to put the emblem, but not so on these Continentals. And Lincoln would continue that in the Continentals for years to come. Even the next generation would have this kind of funny, squashed Lincoln logo. Now, one other thing I'll point out here on the side is, notice this car doesn't have any fender skirts, whereas Cadillacs, typically of the earlier era when this car was introduced back in 1961, still had fender skirts. But Lincoln didn't have fender skirts during this time frame. Cadillac would generally employ them on their cars, but for the next generation Continental, it would have fender skirts. But these cars, these Continentals, never had the skirted fenders. They did have this crease line that you see that runs the length of the body side, and it's not that far down from the top. It's interesting because this car is not done, or the styling is not really executed to make the car look slimmer or leaner or trimmer. It's really done to make it look more authoritative. There's nothing on the body side here to break up the visual heft. That crease is set quite high, actually distinctively high, when you compare it to the inspiration from which it's derived, which was the Continental Mark II, where that crease is much farther down the body side. Here they've moved it up, and so you're left visually with this very large quarter panel, again, kind of emphasizing the overall heft of the vehicle And I believe the designers just wanted to make it look stately and substantial as opposed to a car that was lithe and, let's say, could slip through the air. Just a different overall philosophy. This car is clearly not slipping through the air. I don't even want to know what the coefficient of drag would be on a car like this. I'm sure it's absolutely horrendous. And as we rotate around to this other side, the driver's side, rear three-quarter view, I just wanted to point out a few things on this car. I think you can see that body side crease a little bit better on this car that runs top of the surfaces there. And you can also see the backlight a bit better with this vinyl top and the so-called Frenched-in backlight. In other words, it has a smaller backlight on it than what could really take up the entire rear portion of that particular panel. And that was for the look of privacy, same with that chunky C-pillar, so that if you were sitting in the back in the coach building days, passersby didn't have to necessarily get a good look at you, and that was a styling trait that continued on from that time frame. And lastly, you can see what I mean about this car really emphasizing the visual heft. Look at how thin the rocker panel moldings are on this car. They're almost there just because buyers expected it, but they're de minimis in effect. And there is no rocker molding on the quarter panel aft of the rear wheel. And so you really just get this huge visual mass that makes the car look more imposing and authoritative. Now, as we transition to the inside, I will say that things got interesting in the latter part of this particular generation, Continental's interiors. And this 1968 instrument panel was really a modest revision of the 1967 panel, slightly different area on the right and vents. But the left portion is perhaps the most dramatic difference. And what is the most dramatic difference? Well, where there was once formerly a lot of brushed metal, now there was a lot of fake wood grain everywhere. And you can see from this particular photo that the fake wood grains didn't always match up, but you had fake wood grain on the two-spoke steering wheel, on the steering wheel rim, on the portion of the IP where the speedometer sits, and on the portion of the IP where the climate control panel and the radios sit. That climate control panel and the radio and that speedometer layout with the rolling drum speedometer were all very similar to the previous year's IP, but of course now it had to be adorned with fake wood. You can also see the keyhole there at the bottom right of the area beneath the steering wheel. And one thing I always found interesting about Lincolns of this era is that the keyhole was nicely illuminated if you put the parking lights on, but for whatever reason, when you put the headlamps on, the keyhole would not be illuminated anymore, nor was it illuminated when you opened the door. So Chrysler on Imperial would often illuminate the keyhole when you had opened the door, but for whatever reason, I guess Lincoln thought that you could come into the car and reach around for the headlamp switch, turn it to the parking position, fish your keys out of your pocket, put them in, start the car, then pull the headlamp lever to activate the full headlights. It just always struck me as being a little strange. I will also point out that the so-called flower pot wheel, the one-year only flower pot wheel from the 1967 Continental was gone. That flower pot wheel was used on all Ford products for 1967. By 1968, they had gone to the collapsible steering column, so that obviated the need for that enormously large so-called flower pot center hub design. Now, I also wanted to show you what some over-the-top, lavish, and ornate interiors you could get in your 68 Continental. Many people just got kind of standard-looking leather, but take a look at this cloth pattern here. I mean, it just looks like it belongs somewhere other than on the interior of a car. Let's just say someplace that gentlemen may see in the evening with a lady, and leave it at that. I guess it's tasteful. It looks interesting, but you could definitely jazz up your Lincoln with some very over-the-top interiors. That was not the case earlier in the 1960s. The interiors were rather tasteful and muted. I would not call this necessarily tasteful or muted, but just interesting, and certainly a conversation piece now. And maybe that's what it was back then too, and perhaps why Lincoln designers elected to put interiors like this in their vehicles. Now, under hood in your 68 Continental was the new for 1968 460 cubic inch V8 that was an all-new V8 derived from the 385 series family of V8 engines, not the MEL or Mercury Edsel Lincoln V8s that had preceded this particular engine. And The MEL V8s is an example, and the Continentals, when this car was first launched in 1961, they measured 430 cubic inches. They were later enlarged to 462 cubic inches. Really, once Imperial had a 440 underhood and Cadillac had a 429, Lincoln, I guess, just thought that a 430 wouldn't do. They had to have a 462. By this point, as I said, they had introduced this all-new engine that would last for many, many years. And overall good, proven design, unfortunately, would come topped with the Autolite 4300 carburetor. This engine was actually designed from the get-go for emissions because automakers knew that emission standards were coming. In fact, some were already being imposed by the late 1960s, and so this engine and carburetor combination were actually designed together. It was one of the first times, maybe the first time, that Ford Motor Company actually designed the engine with its fuel system. The engineers worked together. And that was to really help reduce emissions. So this was an early emissions V8, but it still is very powerful. I will tell you, the V8, the 460 V8, the premium fuel 460 is something that'll move these big cars around very, very well, and the Marks as well. Now, an interesting tidbit is that the MEL V8s had the power steering pump driven off the front end of the crankshaft. That would continue on these early 460 cubic inch V8s for a few model years before they would go to the more standard power steering pump. But not only was the power steering pump driven off the front end of the crankshaft, but on these Continentals, the wipers were also hydraulic. So you can see here in this picture, the hydraulic lines going into the firewall, and that was for the wiper control. So you didn't have an intermittent delay feature here that would pulse the wipers on or off. Instead, you could continuously vary the wipe speed. This was something that had been employed in Thunderbirds. And remember, Thunderbirds and Continentals were produced in the same facility at this point, the Wixom assembly plant in Wixom, Michigan. And so this Continental employed that Thunderbird technology. And for those who don't know, the 61 Continental design actually started out as a Thunderbird design. Watch some of my other videos and you can learn more about that. Now, as we transition to the underbody of the car, I wanted to show this. These cars are unibody. They do have coil springs up front, leaf springs out back. Yes, leaf springs, despite the luxury ride, although Chrysler had leaf springs out back for many, many years, torsion bars up front in their case. But take a look at the transmission mounting here. You can see all the rubber isolators that are employed to make sure that vibration does not transmit its way from the engine and transmission into the body and the passenger compartment. These cars, I would say, despite them being unibody, and unibody often having a reputation for being noisier than body-on-frame vehicles, these are very, very quiet. And unibody, when engineers wanted it to be, could be quiet back in the day. It could also be a cheap way to manufacture, as an example in the case of American Motors vehicles that were also unibody. But clearly this Lincoln was employing some better technology than what was in those standard run-of-the-mill American Motors cars. And lastly, we have the huge trunk that could accommodate 8 bodies or more. I have filled one of the trunks on my cars with 6 golf bags, and I could probably fit another 6. These are deep well trunks. The fuel tank is located vertically behind the rear seat, a great placement for it so that it's not, let's say, in harm's way in a rear impact collision. It gives you this beautiful deep well floor trunk that Ford had even on the Panther platform cars, the last Panther platform cars that were sold in the 2000s. Some people loved it, some people hated it. It gave you this extra carrying capacity. But remember, when you got the trunk lid up, you do also have to kind of bend down pretty far to get your groceries if you put those back there. And I think that's one reason why people didn't like that. So, you can't have everything. You have to just take what you've got. So what do you think about the 68 Continental? What's your favorite feature? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Thanks again for watching.